Welcome to the Daily Brain Podcast. Today's word is totality.
Ooh.
Words are the building blocks of thought.
Hmm.
Each day we'll introduce a new one to empower your conversations and sharpen your understanding of the world.
I like it.
Like and subscribe to keep growing your word power daily. You know how we often try to categorize everything?
Right.
Put it all in these neat little boxes?
Absolutely.
That's what we're diving into today, the
Yes.
concept of totality.
All right.
We've got some fascinating excerpts from philosopher Emmanuel Levinas's work,
Oh, cool.
along with some commentary that really unpacks this idea.
It's so true. We do love our labels
Right.
and categories.
Yeah.
But Levinas argues that this obsession with totality can actually limit us.
Okay.
He sees it as a way of shutting ourselves off from the true richness and complexity of the world, and most importantly, our relationships.
So instead of trying to fit everything into a neat system, what does he suggest?
Well, he proposes we embrace what he calls,
Infinity. This represents everything that lies beyond our grasp, the other,
Okay.
that challenges our assumptions
Right.
and forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding.
Infinity and the other.
Yeah,
Those sound pretty abstract.
a little bit.
Can you give me a real-world example of what that might look like?
Imagine you're having a conversation with someone
Okay.
who has completely different beliefs than you.
Mm-hmm.
Levinas would say that in that encounter, you're face-to-face with infinity,
Oh, interesting.
their experiences, their perspective.
Yeah.
It's a vast unknown that disrupts your own way of seeing things.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that connects to totality.
Okay.
It's like we're tempted to categorize that person
Right.
to fit them into our existing framework instead of really being open to their otherness.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Levinas argues that this encounter with the other
Okay.
creates an ethical obligation.
An ethical obligation. It's a call to responsibility
Okay.
to move beyond our self-centered view of the world and truly see the other person.
So it's not just about acknowledging that people are different.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to them
Yes.
simply because they exist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even uses the example of giving a talk,
Okay.
like we're doing now.
Oh, interesting.
He felt obligated to make it worthwhile for the listener to
Right.
respond to their presence.
Right.
Even though he couldn't fully grasp their individual experiences. It's this responsibility, this
Pretty-
acknowledgement of the other
Okay.
that Levinas calls ethics as first philosophy.
Wow. Ethics as first philosophy.
I know, it's a big one.
So he's saying that morality isn't just an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
It's the very foundation of how we understand the world.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And it completely flips the traditional philosophical script.
Wow.
This concept has profound implications,
Okay.
not just for philosophy, but for how we live our lives, how we approach things like education,
Right.
even how our brains work.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm intrigued.
it's a lot.
How does this apply to something like education?
Well, think about it.
Okay.
A totality approach to education would be all about ticking boxes,
Yeah.
meeting requirements,
Okay.
focusing on the teacher's performance.
Right.
But Levinas encourages us to consider the student's experience,
Oh,
their unique needs,
Okay.
their otherness.
Okay.
It becomes less about what the teacher does
Right.
and more about what the student actually learns.
It reminds me of a colleague who had to completely rethink a core concept
Oh, wow.
they were teaching because it just didn't translate into a student's cultural understanding.
Oh, interesting.
They were forced to confront the otherness of that student's perspective.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And it highlights how embracing infinity can lead to a richer,
Right.
more meaningful educational experience.
Here's the catch. Our brains seem wired for totality,
Yeah.
always looking for patterns, trying to simplify things.
Mhm.
Isn't that what Gestalt psychology is all about?
You're right.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
Levinas would argue that even our natural tendency to perceive the world in terms of patterns and wholes,
Okay.
which Gestalt principles so clearly illustrate,
Right.
can be a form of totality.
So even something as basic as how we see the world can be influenced by this desire
Yeah.
to categorize and control.
Precisely.
Wow.
For example, the Gestalt principle of pregnance
Okay.
describes our tendency to perceive things in the simplest,
Right.
most orderly way possible.
Mm-hmm.
But Levinas might suggest that this drive for simplicity
Oh.
can blind us to the nuances and complexities of infinity.
So we're almost hardwired for totality,
It seems so.
even on a perceptual level.
Yeah.
That's a pretty challenging thought.
It is.
How do we even begin to break free from that?
It is challenging, and I think that's what makes Levinas's work so compelling. He doesn't shy away from the difficulty of embracing infinity.
Yeah.
It can be uncomfortable, even unsettling, to truly confront the otherness of another person.
It makes me think of those moments when you feel truly seen by someone,
Oh, yeah.
like they're looking beyond your surface and recognizing your complexities. It can be a little intimidating.
Exactly. Levinas describes this encounter with the other as a kind of invasion,
Wow.
a disruption of our carefully constructed ego. It forces us to question our own assumptions and to recognize that our perspective is just one among many.
So how do we navigate that discomfort? How can we stay open to infinity without feeling overwhelmed or losing ourselves?
That's the heart of it, and where the idea of ethical responsibility comes in.
Right.
Levinas argues that true responsibility comes from a place of vulnerability. It's about being willing to be affected by the other,
Yeah.
to have our own sense of self challenged and transformed by the encounter.
That's a powerful idea. It suggests that we need to create spaces where people feel safe enough to be vulnerable,
Right.
to share their perspectives openly, and to truly listen to each other.
Yes, and one of those spaces could be the classroom.
Oh, interesting.
One of the sources we're looking at discusses how embracing Levinas's ideas in education might mean letting go of some control as a teacher,
Okay.
allowing for more open dialogue and exploration.
So instead of just lecturing and expecting students to absorb information,
Right.
we should be encouraging them to engage critically, to question their own assumptions, and to be open to new perspectives.
Precisely. It's about moving beyond a totality approach where the teacher holds all the right answers and creating an environment where the saying, the back and forth exchange of ideas, takes precedence over the said, those fixed facts and rules.
I see what you mean. It's about recognizing that true learning comes from the messy, dynamic process of engaging with different perspectives, even if it means letting go of some certainty.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge that this approach isn't without its challenges. What happens when a student expresses an idea that's deeply problematic or offensive?
Oh.
Do we just let it slide in the name of open dialogue?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
It feels like there's a tension between fostering open dialogue and creating a safe and respectful learning environment.
You're right. There is the source we're looking at acknowledges this tension, suggesting that there are times when certain ideas might need to be challenged or even shut down. But the key is to approach those situations with a sense of ethical responsibility, not just to the individual student, but to the learning community as a whole.
So it's about finding that balance between open exploration and creating a space where everyone feels respected and heard. That sounds like a tall order.
It is, and it requires careful thought, active listening, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations. But ultimately, Levinas would argue that this kind of ethical engagement is at the heart of true education.
It sounds like this approach to education is as much about personal growth as it is about academic learning.
Absolutely. Levinas would say that true education is fundamentally ethical.
Okay.
It's about becoming more responsible, more responsive, and more attuned to the needs of others, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
It's a profound shift from seeing education as simply a means to an end, like getting a job or acquiring knowledge. It becomes more about cultivating our capacity for connection and ethical responsibility.
It is. It's about recognizing that knowledge isn't something we possess and control, but something that can transform us, connect us, and guide us towards a more meaningful way of being in the world.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. It makes me wonder, though, about the tension between this responsibility to the other and our own well-being. If we're always focused outwards, what happens to our own needs and desires?
That's a really important question, and one that a lot of people struggle with.
Right.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the suffering in the world, to feel like we're constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
Exactly. How can we be present for others without sacrificing our own sense of our own well-being?
It's a delicate balance, for sure. I don't think Levinas would suggest that we need to erase ourselves to be ethically responsible.
Yeah.
In fact, I think he'd argue that true responsibility requires us to be fully present, grounded in our own sense of self.
So it's not about denying our own needs,
Right.
but about finding a way to integrate them with our responsibilities to others.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we are all part of an interconnected web of relationships, that our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of those around us. True fulfillment comes not from isolating ourselves, but from engaging with the world in a meaningful and compassionate way.
That makes sense. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
We need to take care of ourselves to be truly present for others.
Exactly. And that presence, that availability to others is where ethical responsibility becomes a gift, not a burden. It's an opportunity to connect with something larger than ourselves, to experience the richness of human connection, and to make a positive difference in the world.
It's a beautiful thought. So it's not about self-sacrifice,
No.
but about finding that sweet spot where our own well-being and our responsibility to the other can coexist, maybe even enhance each other.
You put it perfectly. It's about recognizing that true freedom and happiness come from living a life that's both meaningful and compassionate.
And that means being willing to step outside our comfort zones, to be challenged by the other, and to allow ourselves to be transformed by those encounters.
You know, all this talk about the other as something outside of ourselves makes me think about how we might also encounter otherness within us.
What do you mean?
Well, we've been talking about the other as something external, like another person that challenges our assumptions.
Right.
But what if there are parts of ourselves that are other to us, aspects we haven't fully acknowledged or that we try to suppress?
Whoa, that's a mind-bending thought. You're saying there's an other within us, too.
It's a fascinating idea to consider. What if our shadows, our fears or insecurities, even our dreams and aspirations are in some ways other to our conscious selves? What if they, too, are calling us to responsibility?
It's like that inner critic. We all have the voice that tells us we're not good enough.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of trying to silence it, we need to listen, try to understand what it's trying to tell us.
There's a lot of wisdom in that approach. What if instead of trying to control every aspect of ourselves, we embrace the infinity within? What if we allow ourselves to be surprised and even transformed by those parts of ourselves we haven't fully confronted?
It sounds like a journey of self-discovery, but one that takes a lot of courage and honesty.
Absolutely. But I think the rewards are immeasurable because ultimately it's by embracing our own otherness that we become more whole, more compassionate, and more capable of connecting with others authentically.
Okay, we've been talking about how Levina's challenges are a usual way of thinking, how we can get stuck in totality. But how do we actually live this out? What are some practical ways to cultivate that awareness of infinity, that responsibility to the other in our daily lives?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in these big concepts, but Levinas isn't calling for some grand, abstract gesture. It can be as simple as truly listening to someone without interrupting or trying to fit their experience into your own framework.
Just that act of deep listening, being present with someone, that's a powerful way to acknowledge their otherness.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone we encounter has a story, a perspective that can enrich our own understanding of the world if we're open to it. And it can be about making a conscious effort to connect with people outside your usual circles, those who have different backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences.
It's like intentionally expanding our own world, acknowledging the vastness of infinity, instead of staying comfortable in our familiar categories.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about who we interact with, but how we approach the world in general. It's about being willing to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to explain everything, to be open to the mystery and ambiguity that life throws our way.
So instead of clinging to our need for certainty and control, we lean into the unknown, the unexpected. We embrace that infinity that lies beyond our grasp.
Precisely. It's about cultivating a sense of wonder and being willing to be surprised by the world and the people in it. True knowledge isn't about mastery and control, but about approaching life with humility, curiosity, and an unwavering commitment to ethical responsibility.
It's a powerful shift in perspective. So as we wrap up this deep dive into totality and infinity, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that totality is a constant force, one that can subtly limit our understanding and relationships if we're not mindful. We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to simplify, categorize, reduce everything to easily digestible chunks.
It's almost like our default setting as humans.
It is, and the challenge is to resist that, to remember there's always more to the story, more to learn, more to experience than we can ever fully grasp. It's about actively embracing that infinity.
So the next time you find yourself trying to neatly categorize or explain something, remember infinity. Remember the other. Maybe that's a person, a situation, even a part of yourself you haven't fully acknowledged.
Exactly. Challenge that urge to totalize and be open to what lies beyond your current understanding. Who knows what you might discover?
That's it for today's deep dive into totality. We hope you found it insightful, and as always, we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep expanding your world.